When veteran Jacob and his companion Ghost arrived to claim their inheritance, they were searching for a peaceful beginning. But standing beside the small cabin was something that promised anything but peace. A dilapidated watchtower. This tower wasn't built for the scenery. It was built to stand guard against a threat hiding in the darkness. Jacob thought he had found a shelter, but the true inheritance he received wasn't land. It was an unfinished war. Please support us by subscribing to the channel. The city breathed a relentless rhythm of sirens and horns, a constant assault that grated on Jacob's nerves. From his small fourth-floor apartment, the world was a blur of hurried movement and impatient noise. He stood by the window, a tall man whose lean frame still held the disciplined strength of his past life. At 38, his short brown hair was already surrendering to distinguished streaks of silver at the temples, framing a face etched with the kind of hardship that makes a man look older than his years, yet his eyes held a quiet kindness. He wore his daily uniform, a worn plaid shirt with a pattern of navy, gray, and pale beige, left unbuttoned over a simple gray t-shirt, paired with faded blue jeans and the sturdy work boots that were the only footwear he trusted. Beside him, a silent guardian sat patiently on the floor. Ghost, a 5-year-old German shepherd, was a magnificent creature. His thick coat was a rare blend of silver gray and white, giving him an almost wolf-like appearance that seemed out of place in the cramped apartment. His amber eyes, intelligent and watchful, rarely strayed from Jacob. He was calm by nature, a steady presence in the chaos of Jacob's post-military life. They had been a unit for years, a bond forged not in the comfort of a suburban home, but in the dust and tension of Afghanistan. Ghost was not a pet. He was a comrade, an anchor. A sudden car backfire from the street below sent a jolt through Jacob's body. His hand instinctively went to his side, where a weapon no longer hung. His breathing hitched. Before the wave of panic could crest, a wet nose nudged firmly against his hand. Jacob looked down into Ghost's unwavering gaze. The dog whined softly, a low rumble in his chest, not of aggression, but of profound concern. Jacob exhaled slowly, his shoulders slumping as he reached down to scratch behind the dog's ears. "It's okay, boy," he murmured, his voice a low rasp. "Just the city being the city." Ghost leaned into the touch, his solid weight a grounding force. This was their routine. The world would scream, and Ghost would pull Jacob back from the edge. Life after the Army Rangers was a war of a different kind, fought not in the mountains, but inside his own head. The city, with its crowds and its sudden sharp noises, was a battlefield he was losing on. Every day was a struggle to find a foothold, to make sense of a world that no longer operated on clear missions and unwavering brotherhood. The buzz of the intercom was an unwelcome intrusion. Jacob tensed again. He rarely had visitors. Ghost let out a single, sharp bark, positioning himself between Jacob and the door. Jacob pressed the button. "Yeah?" A crackled, unfamiliar voice answered. "Courier for Jacob." A few minutes later, he was holding a crisp manila envelope. Inside was a letter, thick and formal, bearing the letterhead of a law firm in Helena, Montana. He read the words slowly, his brow furrowed in confusion. It was a summons to the reading of the last will and testament of Arthur, his great-uncle. Arthur. The name was a ghost from his childhood, a whisper in old family stories. Jacob had only met him once, a vague memory of a tall, quiet man with eyes that seemed to look right through you. He was the family eccentric, the one who had disappeared into the wilds of Montana decades ago and was rarely heard from since. The journey to Montana was a pilgrimage toward an unknown. Jacob packed what little he owned into his old pickup truck, Ghost claiming the passenger seat as his rightful throne. With every mile that put the city behind them, Jacob felt a layer of tension peel away. The endless sky and rolling plains of the heartland were a balm to his frayed soul. Ghost seemed to sense it too, resting his head on the open window, his ears flapping in the wind, a look of pure contentment on his face. The law office of Mr. Sterling was a small, quiet space in a brick building on Helena's main street. Mr. Sterling himself was a man in his late 60s, with thinning gray hair and a kind, weary face. He greeted Jacob with a firm handshake and a sad smile. "I was sorry to hear about Arthur," Mr. Sterling said, gesturing for Jacob to sit. "He was a client for a long time, a very private man." Jacob sat, Ghost settling at his feet with a quiet sigh. The office was silent, a stark contrast to the city he had just left. He looked around, expecting to see other family members, distant cousins he hadn't seen since he was a child. But the room was empty. "Am I the first one here?" Jacob asked. Mr. Sterling adjusted his glasses and looked at him over the rims. "You're the only one, son. Arthur didn't have much contact with the rest of the family in his later years." The lawyer opened a folder on his desk and cleared his throat. He began to read in a dry, formal tone. The legal language washed over Jacob until a few key phrases snagged his attention. "Do hereby bequeath the entirety of my property, including the land, the cabin, the outbuildings, and all contents therein, located at the following coordinates." He read a long string of numbers. "To my great-nephew, Jacob." Jacob blinked. That was it. No other bequests, no other names mentioned, just him. He had inherited it all. "The whole property?" Jacob asked, his voice barely a whisper. "All of it," Mr. Sterling confirmed. "About 300 acres from what the deed says. It's remote, very remote. There's a small trust set up to cover the property taxes for the next decade, but beyond that, there isn't any money, just the land." A strange silence settled over the room. Jacob had expected a dispute, a fight over whatever small value the land held, but there was nothing. No angry phone calls, no other relatives demanding their share. It was as if the rest of the family had collectively decided long ago that Arthur and his wild piece of Montana were not worth the trouble. It was an inheritance granted not with celebration, but with a profound and unsettling quiet. Mr. Sterling slid a heavy iron key across the polished desk. "This is for the cabin. Arthur left it here for you. He also left this." He passed over a worn, leather-bound journal. He said you would know what to do with it. "It X's." Jacob took the key and the journal, his mind reeling. He had come to Montana expecting nothing. Now, he was the owner of a kingdom of pine and rock, a forgotten piece of the world. He looked down at Ghost, who looked back up at him, his tail giving a slow, hopeful thump against the floor. For the first time in years, Jacob felt the flicker of a feeling he had long thought buried. Purpose. Or maybe it was just peace. The old truck rumbled along a gravel road that had long since surrendered to the whims of nature. What started as a marked county route out of Helena had devolved into a pair of dirt tracks winding deeper into the vast, unforgiving beauty of the Montana wilderness. Jacob gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white, navigating the deep ruts and loose stones with a practiced focus. Beside him, Ghost sat alert, his ears swiveling to catch the unfamiliar sounds of the forest, his nose twitching at the scent of pine and damp earth. They had left the quiet civility of Mr. Sterling's office hours ago, driving toward the coordinates etched in the legal documents. The journey itself was a kind of therapy. The farther they got from civilization, the more Jacob felt the tight knot in his chest begin to loosen. The sky here was a piercing blue, vast and unbroken by skyscrapers. The air was clean, carrying the crisp promise of autumn. It was a world away from the suffocating concrete maze he had left behind. This was a new beginning, a clean slate. The truck crested a final rise, and the road ended abruptly in a small, overgrown clearing. Before them stood their inheritance. The cabin was a simple structure, built from thick, dark logs, its roof sagging slightly in the middle, like the spine of an old man. Time and weather had weathered the wood to a silvery gray, and patches of moss grew in the shaded corners. A stone chimney stood sentinel at one end, a thin wisp of long-dead smoke still clinging to Jacob's imagination. But it was the structure next to it that truly captured his attention. A watchtower, tall and rustic, rose into the sky. It was built entirely of wood, a testament to raw, functional craftsmanship rather than elegance. A simple wooden ladder was fixed to its side, climbing up to a small enclosed cabin at the very top. It looked like something from another era, a silent guardian watching over the silent woods. The entire scene was one of profound isolation, a small pocket of human existence carved out of an immense, wild kingdom. "Well, boy," Jacob said, his voice quiet. "Looks like we're home." Ghost whined in response, his tail thumping a soft rhythm against the truck's bench seat. He was eager to explore. Jacob killed the engine, and the sudden silence was overwhelming. It wasn't empty, it was filled with the subtle music of the wilderness. The rustle of leaves in the gentle breeze, the distant call of a bird, the hum of insects. It was a silence that felt alive. He grabbed the heavy iron key and the journal from the dashboard and stepped out of the truck. The air was cool and invigorating. Ghost leaped out after him, immediately trotting around the perimeter of the clearing, his nose to the ground, taking in every new scent. Jacob approached the cabin, his boots crunching on fallen pine needles. The front porch consisted of 3 wide steps and a small covered landing. As he got closer, he started to notice things that seemed out of place with the cabin's otherwise neglected appearance. The windows, though small, were made of a thick, heavy glass that didn't quite ripple the way old glass should. It looked almost like the bullet-resistant glass he'd seen on military vehicles. He ran a hand over the main door. It was solid oak, heavy and unyielding. But as he examined the frame, he saw the faint outline of a steel bar that had been recessed into the wood on the inside. He paused, a flicker of unease mixing with his curiosity. Why would a recluse in the middle of nowhere need to turn his home into a fortress? This wasn't the work of a man seeking solitude, it was the work of a man who expected trouble. He slid the heavy key into the lock. It turned with a satisfying, deep clunk. The door swung inward on well-oiled hinges, revealing a single, large room shrouded in shadows and the dusty scent of disuse. Sunlight streamed in through the small, reinforced windows, illuminating floating dust motes in golden shafts. The interior was Spartan. A simple wooden bed was pushed against one wall, a rough wool blanket folded neatly on top. A stone fireplace, large enough to heat the entire cabin, dominated the far wall. In the center of the room sat a sturdy wooden table and 2 chairs. A small kitchenette area with a hand pump for water and a wood-burning stove occupied one corner. It was basic, functional, and surprisingly clean, as if Arthur had prepared it for a visitor just before he left. Jacob set the journal on the table and began a more thorough inspection. He confirmed his suspicion about the door. A heavy steel bar was designed to slide into brackets bolted directly into the log walls, a simple but incredibly effective barricade. All the windows were indeed made of some kind of reinforced, shatterproof glass. He looked out one of the small windows toward the Watchtower. It stood there, silent and mysterious. His great-uncle Arthur, the man he barely knew, was becoming more of an enigma with every discovery. He hadn't just built a home here, he had built a stronghold. The question was, what was he hiding from? Or, what was he watching for? Ghost padded back inside, his exploration complete for now. He came to Jacob's side and nudged his hand, as if sensing the shift in his mood from peaceful relief to pensive concern. Jacob knelt and wrapped an arm around his friend's powerful shoulders. "This place is more than it seems, buddy," he whispered into Ghost's fur. "A lot more." The sun began to dip below the towering pines, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. The forest grew darker, the shadows longer. In the profound silence of his new kingdom, Jacob felt the weight of his uncle's secrets settling around him. This wasn't just a new beginning, it was the start of a mystery. Days bled into weeks, each one marked by the rising and setting of the sun over the vast expanse of pines. The frantic, jarring rhythm of the city faded from Jacob's memory, replaced by the steady, ancient pulse of the wilderness. He and Ghost fell into a new routine, one governed by necessity and the natural order of the forest. Their mornings began with the first gray light of dawn. Jacob would rise, the cool air a shock to his system, and build a fire in the stone hearth. The crackle of burning wood and the scent of brewing coffee became the sounds of his new life. While Jacob planned the day's work, Ghost would be at the door, whining softly, eager for their morning patrol. They would walk the perimeter of the clearing, two soldiers surveying their territory. Jacob, with his eyes scanning the tree line for anything out of the ordinary, and Ghost, with his nose to the ground, reading the stories left behind in the night by the forest's other inhabitants. The work was hard and physical, a welcome ache in muscles that had grown soft in the city. Jacob patched the sagging roof of the cabin, replacing rotten shingles with new ones. He split himself from a fallen cedar. He cleared the overgrown path leading to a nearby creek, the clear, cold water, a luxury after years of tasting chemicals in city tap water. He chopped wood, the rhythmic thud of the axe, a steadying beat, stacking the logs high against the cabin wall in preparation for the coming winter. With every swing of the axe, every nail hammered into place, Jacob felt a piece of himself being rebuilt. The hypervigilance that had plagued him in the city slowly transformed. Here, it was not a symptom of his trauma, but a useful skill. He learned to distinguish the sound of a squirrel chattering in a branch from the warning cry of a blue jay. The sudden snap of a twig no longer sent his heart racing with panic. Instead, he would pause, listen, and identify the cause: a deer moving through the underbrush, a fox on the hunt. The forest was teaching him to listen again, not with fear, but with a quiet, observant respect. Ghost thrived in this new kingdom. The confines of the apartment had been a cage for his spirit. Here, he was in his element. He would spend hours exploring the woods around the cabin, always staying within earshot of Jacob's whistle. He would return, his silver-gray fur dotted with burrs and leaves, his tongue lolling in a happy grin, and collapse by the fireplace with a contented sigh. The bond between them, already strong, deepened into an unspoken understanding, a look, a flick of the ears, a soft whine, that was all they needed to communicate. Yet, as the weeks wore on, Jacob began to notice that the peace he had found was not absolute. There was a fragile quality to it, a sense that they were not entirely alone. The first time it happened, he was jolted from a deep sleep by a low, guttural growl. He sat up, his senses on high alert. In the moonlight, filtering through the small window, he could see Ghost's silhouette. The dog was standing stock still by the reinforced door, his body rigid, the fur on his back raised. The growl rumbled deep in his chest, a sound of warning Jacob had not heard since their days overseas. "What is it, boy?" Jacob whispered, swinging his legs out of bed. He moved silently to the door and peered through the thick glass of the window. The clearing was bathed in pale moonlight, the shadows of the pines long and dark. Nothing moved. There was no sound but the gentle whisper of the wind. He stayed there for a long time, watching, listening. After nearly an hour, Ghost finally relaxed, shaking his body as if to shed the tension, and padded back to the foot of the bed. Jacob, however, did not sleep much for the rest of the night. It happened again a few nights later, and then again the following week. Always the same: a low growl, a rigid stance, and an unwavering stare into the dark, silent woods. During the day, Jacob started finding small things, anomalies that a normal person might overlook, but that a trained observer could not ignore. While clearing a game trail, he found a branch, thick as his wrist, snapped cleanly in two. It was too high off the ground for a deer or a bear to have done it, and the break was too clean, too unnatural. A few days later, near the creek, he saw a faint impression in the mud. It was distorted by rain, but it was not the track of any animal he recognized, and it was larger than his own boot print. He tried to rationalize it. A lost hiker, perhaps. A hunter scouting the area before the season opened. But the incidents felt stealthy, furtive. Whoever or whatever was out there, they did not want to be seen. He would stand by the edge of the clearing in the evenings, watching the sun go down, a familiar feeling of being watched creeping up his spine. For now, he pushed the thoughts aside, focusing on his work, on the peace he had fought so hard to find. But in the back of his mind, a soldier's instinct was sounding a quiet, persistent alarm. His fortress, it seemed, might have a reason to exist after all. A week passed in quiet diligence. The strange signs in the woods had not reappeared, and Ghost's nightly growling had ceased. A fragile sense of normalcy began to settle over the clearing, and Jacob allowed himself to hope that whatever had been out there had simply moved on. He had finished reinforcing a loose section of the porch railing and was now splitting the last of a large pine log, his movements economical and strong. The crisp autumn air was filled with the satisfying scent of freshly cut wood. He sank the axe into the chopping block and wiped a bead of sweat from his brow with the back of his sleeve. He looked around for Ghost, expecting to see him dozing in a patch of afternoon Sunday, but the dog was not in his usual spot. Jacob scanned the clearing and found him at the foot of the watchtower. He was not resting. Ghost was utterly fixated on a spot near the tower's foundation, close to where a thick, gnarled root from an ancient pine broke the surface of the soil. His body was tense, his tail low and rigid. A low, persistent whine escaped his throat, a sound of intense concentration. As Jacob watched, Ghost began to dig, his powerful front paws sending clumps of dark earth and pine needles flying behind him. He would dig furiously for a moment, then pause to shove his nose deep into the hole, sniffing intently before starting again. This was not the playful digging of a bored dog. This was a mission. "Ghost, what are you doing?" Jacob called out, his voice calm. The dog ignored him. He looked back over his shoulder, his amber eyes wide and urgent, and let out a single, sharp bark. It was a summons. Then he immediately returned to his task, the dirt flying faster now. Jacob set his tools aside and walked over, his curiosity piqued. He remembered the nightly vigils, the unshakable feeling of being watched. He had learned long ago that Ghost's instincts were far sharper than his own. The dog had saved his life more than once by sensing a threat long before any human could. Trusting him was second nature. He knelt beside his friend, who was now panting, his silver-gray fur dusted with soil. Jacob peered into the shallow hole. He could see nothing but dirt and roots. "What is it, boy? What did you find?" Ghost barked again and nudged Jacob's hand with his wet nose, pushing him toward the hole. That was all the confirmation Jacob needed. His partner was telling him, in the clearest way he knew how, that something important was buried here. All right, I get it," Jacob said, giving the dog a reassuring pat. "Let me get a shovel. You're making a mess." "All way." He retrieved a small entrenching tool from his truck, a familiar weight in his hand from his army days. Returning to the spot, he gently nudged Ghost aside and began to dig, following the hole the dog had started. The earth was soft and loamy, easy to turn over. He worked for several minutes, widening the hole, the only sound the scrape of the shovel against the occasional rock. Then, with a dull thud, the spade hit something hard. It wasn't a rock. The sound was hollow, metallic. A jolt of adrenaline shot through him. He slowed his pace, digging more carefully around the object. Slowly, the outline of a dark green, metal box emerged from the soil. It looked like an old military ammunition can, about a foot long and half as wide. It was caked in mud and rust, but it seemed to have been wrapped in a thick, oil-soaked canvas, which had protected it from the worst of the moisture. He worked the spade underneath it, and carefully pried it loose. It was heavier than he expected. He lifted it from the ground and set it on a patch of grass, wiping the dirt from its lid. Ghost sat beside him, watching his every move, his tail giving a single, slow wag, as if to say, "I told you so." The latch was rusted shut. Jacob pulled out his utility knife and used the tip to scrape away the corrosion before wedging it under the lever. He put his weight into it, and with a loud, groaning creak, the latch popped open. The seal had held. The inside was perfectly dry. He lifted the lid. Lying on a bed of what looked like more oilcloth was not ammunition, but two carefully placed objects. The first was a key. It was unlike any key he had ever seen. Forged from heavy dark steel, it was about 4 inches long, with a simple loop for a head. But the bit was a solid, three-dimensional, six-pointed star. He picked it up. It was cold and solid in his palm, a piece of precise, unusual engineering. Beside it lay a round brass disc, about the size of his palm. It was tarnished with age, but as he rubbed the surface with his thumb, the metal gleamed with a dull, golden light. Etched into its surface was a complex pattern of lines and dots. It was a star chart, a map of a constellation, though he didn't recognize it immediately. The craftsmanship was intricate, clearly done by a skilled hand. Jacob sat back on his heels, the key in one hand, the disc in the other. These were not random items. They were deliberate, placed with purpose. This was a message from his uncle, a puzzle left behind. He looked up at the silent watchtower looming over them, then down at the cryptic objects in his hands. A cold certainty settled in his stomach. He was no longer just a recluse fixing up a cabin. He was the inheritor of a secret, and he had just found the first two pieces. The sun had dipped below the jagged peaks of the distant mountains, plunging the clearing into the long, deep shadows of twilight. A chill crept into the air, carrying the scent of pine and impending night. Jacob sat at the rough-hewn table inside the cabin, the warm glow of a kerosene lamp pushing back the encroaching darkness. On the wood surface before him lay the strange inheritance, the heavy steel key shaped like a star, the tarnished brass disc etched with a celestial map, and the worn leather journal his uncle had left for him. Ghost lay at his feet, head on his paws, but his amber eyes were open and watchful, tracking Jacob's every move. The dog seemed to understand the gravity of the moment, the shift from simple solitude to profound mystery. For a long while, Jacob just looked at the objects. They felt like artifacts from a forgotten world, imbued with a purpose he could not yet comprehend. The key was a question, the disc was a map to an unknown destination, and the journal, he hoped, was the answer key. He picked it up. The leather was soft and supple from years of use. He opened it to the first page. The handwriting was small and neat, the precise script of an engineer or an architect. The early entries were dated years ago, filled with observations of the natural world. Arthur had documented the migration patterns of birds, the changing colors of the seasons, the behavior of a family of deer that frequented the creek. It read like the diary of a man who had successfully divorced himself from the world of men and found solace in the rhythms of the wild. Jacob felt a pang of kinship with the author, recognizing the same search for peace that had driven him here. He turned the pages, scanning the entries. The peaceful observations continued for a long time, page after page of meticulous notes on the forest. But slowly, subtly, the tone began to change. Interspersed with notes on the flora and fauna were other, more unsettling observations. An entry from the spring of 2021 mentioned unnatural silence in the woods at night, a time when even the insects seemed to hold their breath. Another entry spoke of paths where none should be, trails that were too wide for animals and too straight for hikers. Jacob's focus sharpened. He was no longer reading the journal of a naturalist. He was reading the field notes of a watchman. He kept reading, his dinner forgotten. Deeper into the journal, he found a page that made him stop. The entry was from 2 years prior. Tucked between the pages was a faded newspaper clipping. It was a small article from a national paper, detailing the homecoming of an Army Ranger unit from a long deployment in Afghanistan. There was a grainy photo of the soldiers disembarking from a transport plane, and there, near the back, was a younger, harder version of himself. Beneath the clipping, Arthur had written in his precise hand, "My brother's grandson. I have followed his career from a distance. The papers print his name, but they do not know the man. They speak of valor, of medals won in the dust and the heat. They do not speak of the cost." Jacob's breath caught in his throat. He had always assumed Arthur was just a name, a distant relative who had forgotten them as completely as they had forgotten him. But he had been watching. He read on, his heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs. He does not know me, but I know him. I see it in the set of his jaw in that photograph. I see the shadow of a watchman in his eyes. He is the only one in the family who would understand this land, this silence. That is why it must be his. I am not leaving him a burden, but a purpose. A wave of emotion washed over Jacob, so powerful it made the room feel small. He felt a connection to the ghost of his great-uncle, a sense of being seen and understood in a way he had not felt since leaving the service. Arthur hadn't seen a broken soldier. He had seen a guardian, a protector. He turned another page and found the entry that explained everything and nothing. I do not dare to write it plainly. They have eyes and ears everywhere, even here. The things I have seen in the night, the metal beasts that move without lights, to write it down would be to sign my own death warrant, and to leave it as a simple letter would endanger anyone who found it. So I have made a lock and a key. This is not a game, but a test that only a soldier can pass. A man trained to see patterns, to follow clues, to understand that the most important things are often hidden in plain sight. Jacob closed the journal and leaned back in his chair, the wood groaning in protest. He looked at the star-shaped key and the brass disc. The test. It all clicked into place. The reinforced cabin, the strange clues, the inheritance itself. It was a mission, passed from one watchman to another. He had spent the last few years trying to escape the man he had been, to shed the skin of the soldier. But Arthur had seen that the soldier was who he was, and he had given him a new post, a new watch to stand. Jacob still didn't know what he was supposed to be looking for or who they were, but he knew where he had to go to find the next piece of the puzzle. His eyes drifted to the window, to the tall, dark silhouette of the Watchtower against the star-dusted sky. The decision was not made with conscious thought. It was a pull, an undeniable imperative. The tower was waiting. Jacob pushed back his chair, the scraping sound loud in the quiet cabin. He picked up the heavy key and the brass disc, their cold weight feeling solid and real in his hands. He grabbed a powerful flashlight from his pack, its metal casing familiar and reassuring. "Stay," he said to Ghost, his voice low and firm. "Watch the cabin." Meeting sold. "By no." Ghost rose to his feet, a soft whine escaping his throat. He followed Jacob to the door, his body language a clear protest. He did not want his partner going into the night alone, especially not up that rickety structure. He nudged Jacob's hand, his amber eyes full of concern. "I'll be fine, boy," Jacob said, giving the dog a firm scratch behind the ears. "I have to do this. You keep watch down here. You're my ground support." "He's our." He opened the heavy door and stepped out into the crisp, cold night. The sky was a vast, glittering canopy of stars, more than he had ever seen from the light-polluted city. They seemed close enough to touch. He looked up at the Watchtower. It was a black needle against the star-dusted velvet of the sky, an imposing and silent sentinel. He walked to its base, the flashlight beam cutting a sharp cone of light through the darkness. The wooden ladder, fixed to the side of the structure, seemed to climb endlessly into the night. The rungs were thick, hand-hewn logs, worn smooth by years of weather and use. He tested the first few. They felt solid enough, but the wood groaned under his weight. Taking a deep breath, he holstered the flashlight on his belt, tucked the key and disc into his pocket, and began to climb. The world shrank to the few feet of ladder, illuminated by his light. Hand over hand, foot over foot, he ascended into the darkness. A light breeze whispered through the pines, making the tower sway ever so slightly. The wood creaked and moaned with each upward step. He didn't look down. His training had taught him to focus only on the task at hand. The rungs were rough under his palms, the threat of a splinter a distant, unimportant concern. He could hear Ghost whining softly from the ground, A tiny, worried sound that grounded him, reminded him what he was climbing for. After what felt like an eternity, his hand reached the top and found the solid edge of a platform. He hauled himself up and into the small enclosed cabin at the tower's peak. He shut the small wooden door behind him, and the sound of the wind was immediately muffled. He unclipped his flashlight and swept its beam around the space. It was a cramped, dusty box, no more than 8 feet square. A single wooden stool sat in the center. The walls were bare wood, except for one, which had a long, narrow slit of a window for observation. Through it, he could see the entire clearing, his own small cabin, a warm, golden speck of light below. It gave him a powerful sense of perspective, of seeing the world as his uncle must have seen it. His gaze swept the room again, looking for the next piece of the puzzle. Against the far wall sat a heavy, footlocker-style military chest, its green paint faded and peeling. It was exactly as he had imagined. But as he examined it, he saw there was no visible lock, no clasp, no hinge he could pry open. It was a solid, sealed box. He pulled the brass disc from his pocket. He shone the flashlight on its surface, the intricate pattern of the constellation gleaming. Arthur's journal had said he had to see the patterns, to look for things hidden in plain sight. He began to scan the cabin walls with the light, searching for a corresponding image. He found it on the wall next to the observation window. Carved into the dark wood was the same constellation, its stars and lines a perfect match for the disk in his hand. It was a beautiful piece of work, clearly a labor of love. He held the disk up next to it, confirming the match. But what now? He ran his fingers over the carving, feeling the smooth, worn wood. It was just a decoration. He was missing something. He thought back to Arthur's words, "A test that only a soldier can pass." A soldier looks for the anomaly, the detail that is out of place. He shone the light on the carving again, this time examining each individual star. Most were simple, shallow divots carved into the wood, but one, in the very center of the constellation, seemed different. It was a separate piece of wood, a small, perfectly round plug, its grain running in a different direction from the surrounding wall. It was almost invisible. His heart began to beat faster. He reached out and pressed his thumb against the small wooden star. It clicked. With a soft scraping sound, a small section of the military chest's front panel slid away, revealing a dark, star-shaped hole. It was a keyhole, a perfect, 3-dimensional match for the steel key in his pocket. A slow smile spread across Jacob's face. It was a moment of pure, intellectual satisfaction, the feeling of a complex problem solved. He felt a profound respect for his uncle's ingenuity. This was Arthur's test, and he had passed. He took the heavy key from his pocket. It felt cool and purposeful in his hand. He slid it into the keyhole. It fit perfectly, sinking into the mechanism with a solid, satisfying weight. He turned it. A series of deep mechanical clicks echoed in the tiny cabin, like the sound of a well-oiled rifle bolt sliding into place. The lid of the chest popped up by an inch. He took a deep breath, his flashlight beam steady on the chest. He reached out, his fingers closing around the edge of the lid, and lifted it open. The air in the small cabin was thick with the scent of old canvas and gun oil. Jacob's flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the contents of the chest. He reached in, his movements slow and deliberate, and lifted out the first object. It was a pair of binoculars, but not like any he had used for birdwatching. They were heavy and solid, with a matte black, rubberized coating. He recognized the design instantly. Military-grade night vision. This was serious equipment, expensive and difficult to obtain for a civilian. Next, he pulled out a slim, waterproof notebook, the kind used for field notes. Its pages were filled with Arthur's same neat, precise script. But this was not about the migration of birds. It was a logbook. Dates, times, and cryptic notes filled the pages. 2 trucks, eastbound, no lights. Movement, near the old logging road, 4 individuals. Cargo, appears heavy, truck riding low. It was a detailed record of illicit activity, a meticulous surveillance journal that spanned several years. Beneath the notebook was a topographical map of the surrounding national forest. It was covered in annotations. A single route was highlighted in red ink, a winding, seemingly abandoned logging trail that snaked through the mountains, bypassing all the main roads. Several points along the route were marked with an X. Observation posts, Jacob guessed. His uncle had not just been a passive observer. He had been an intelligence officer, gathering data on a sophisticated operation. He set the items carefully on the floor beside him. The chest now appeared to be empty, but as he ran his flashlight over the bottom, he noticed the same detail a soldier is trained to look for: an anomaly. The metal floor of the chest was not a single solid piece. There was a faint seam running along the edges. He pressed his fingers into the corners and found a small, recessed lip. He pulled, and the false bottom lifted out with a soft metallic sigh. What lay beneath made the air leave his lungs in a rush. Nestled in a custom-cut foam insert was a rifle. It was a bolt-action hunting rifle, a classic model known for its accuracy and reliability, fitted with a high-quality scope. The wooden stock was dark and oiled, the blued steel of the barrel gleaming even in the dim light. Beside it were 2 boxes of ammunition. The weapon was pristine, perfectly maintained. Jacob lifted the rifle from its cradle. The weight was familiar, balanced, deadly. This was the final piece of the puzzle, the one that changed everything. The reinforced cabin, the surveillance, the hidden clues, and now this. His uncle had not been preparing for a simple confrontation. He had been preparing for a war, and he had left Jacob his entire arsenal. A cold, hard clarity settled over him. This was not a mystery to be solved. It was a battle to be fought. He closed the chest, leaving the rifle where it lay for now. He picked up the night vision binoculars. His purpose, the one Arthur had written about, was clear. The watch started now. He moved to the long, narrow observation window, the same one his uncle must have spent countless nights peering through. The world outside was a landscape of blacks and grays, the shapes of the trees and mountains visible only as silhouettes against the starry sky. He raised the binoculars to his eyes and switched them on. The world exploded into a brilliant, ghostly green. The darkness vanished, replaced by a stunning, eerie clarity. Every pine needle, every rock, every blade of grass in the clearing below was visible in sharp detail. He could see the cabin, his truck, and even Ghost, who was sitting patiently by the door, a loyal, silver-gray statue in the green-tinted night. He settled in, his elbows resting on the wooden sill, and began to scan the forest, his movements slow and methodical, just as he had been trained. He scanned from left to right, then back again, his eyes absorbing the details of the nocturnal world. He watched an owl swoop silently from a branch. He saw a pair of deer step cautiously into a moonlit patch of meadow. The forest was alive, a secret symphony playing out in the darkness. He waited. He didn't know what he was looking for, but Arthur's logbook had given him a clue. The old logging road. He found it on the map, then located its approximate position through the binoculars, a faint line cutting through the dense trees on the far side of the valley. For over an hour, there was nothing. The only movement was the wind in the trees. Doubt began to creep in. Maybe he had been wrong. Maybe the operation had moved on after Arthur's death. Then he saw it. A flicker, a tiny pinprick of unnatural light, instantly extinguished. It was deep in the forest, right where the logging road should be. He focused the binoculars, his heart beginning to pound a steady, familiar rhythm. Minutes passed. Then, a dark shape emerged from the trees, moving without lights, a ghost in the green night. It was the lead truck, a heavy-duty pickup with a modified, lifted suspension. Another followed, and then another, a convoy. They moved with a practiced, military precision that spoke of experience and discipline. But as they drew closer, moving into a section of the road that was more exposed, he noticed something else. Men with rifles walked alongside one specific vehicle in the middle of the convoy, a larger, covered cargo truck. They were acting as foot patrols, their heads constantly scanning the woods. Their posture was tense, their movements sharp and alert. This was not a typical smuggling run. This was a high-stakes, high-security operation. Whatever was in that truck was incredibly important. The level of protection was unusual, almost desperate. Jacob lowered the binoculars, the green world fading back to gray. The symphony of the night had been interrupted by a discordant, menacing note. The silence of the forest was a lie. He looked down at the clearing, at the small, fortified cabin that was now his home. He understood now. Arthur hadn't left him a piece of land. He had left him a watchtower, a listening post on the front line of a hidden war. And tonight, Jacob had officially taken his uncle's place on watch. Jacob remained in the watchtower until the first pale fingers of dawn stretched across the eastern sky, turning the ghostly green world of his binoculars back into a landscape of muted grays and deep purples. He descended the ladder stiffly, his muscles aching from the long, tense vigil. The cold morning air was sharp in his lungs. Ghost met him at the base of the tower, whining softly and nudging his hand, a silent question in his amber eyes. "I'm okay, boy," Jacob murmured, his voice rough from disuse. But things have changed. He spent the morning in a state of controlled, focused activity. The discovery of the convoy had stripped away any lingering uncertainty. This was no longer a mystery to be solved at a leisurely pace. It was an active threat. He retrieved the rifle from the tower, cleaned and oiled it with the meticulous care of a soldier, reunited with a trusted friend, and loaded a magazine. He did not place it back in the chest. Instead, he propped it in the corner next to the cabin's heavy door, within easy reach. He went about his chores, chopping wood and securing the small shed, but his senses were on high alert. Every snap of a twig, every call of a distant bird made him pause and listen. He was a soldier on watch again, the familiar, humming tension a current beneath his skin. He wore his old brown leather jacket over his plaid shirt, a welcome barrier against the growing autumn chill, and a piece of familiar armor against the unknown. It was mid-afternoon when he found the message. He was returning to the cabin after a final check of the clearing's perimeter when he saw it. A piece of paper, stark white against the dark wood of his door, held in place by the tip of a hunting knife plunged deep into the oak. His blood ran cold. He had been in the cabin less than an hour ago. They had been here, close enough to touch his home, while he was mere yards away, and he had not seen or heard a thing. They were professionals. Ghost let out a low, menacing growl, the fur on his neck standing on end. He stood between Jacob and the door, a solid wall of protective muscle. "Easy, boy," Jacob said, his voice a low command. He placed a hand on Ghost's back, a gesture meant to calm the dog as much as himself. He slowly approached the door. The paper was not a note. It was a photograph, old and creased, the colors slightly faded. Jacob's heart hammered against his ribs. He recognized it immediately. It was a picture of his ranger unit, taken in the dusty heat of Kandahar in 2012. 10 men, young and hard, grinning at the camera, their faces smudged with dirt and camouflage paint. His brothers. And there he was, in the center of the group, or where he had been. His own face in the photograph had been violently scratched out with the point of the knife, leaving a shredded, gaping hole in the image. It was a violation, a deeply personal, calculated threat. This was not a random warning. They knew who he was. They knew where he had been. They had gone to the trouble of finding this photograph, this piece of his soul, and had used it to deliver their message. "We can get to you. We know what you were, and we can erase you." A cold, quiet rage, far more dangerous than any hot fury, settled over him. He carefully worked the knife free from the door, his grip sure and steady. He took down the desecrated photograph, folded it once, and put it in his jacket pocket. This changed nothing, except to solidify his resolve. They had meant to scare him. They had only made him more determined. As dusk fell, A heavy silence descended upon the clearing. Jacob did not light the lamp. He sat in the darkness, the rifle resting across his lap, Ghost a silent shadow at his feet. They waited. The moon was a sliver in the sky, offering little light. The woods were a black, impenetrable wall. Hours passed. The only sound was the whisper of the wind. Then, Ghost's head lifted. A low, almost inaudible growl rumbled in his chest. His ears were swiveled toward the dark tree line at the edge of the clearing. Jacob's hand tightened on the rifle. He trusted the dog's senses implicitly. They were not alone. He moved silently from his chair to the floor, positioning himself in the deep shadows beside the small, reinforced window. He peered into the darkness. At first, he saw nothing. Then, he caught the movement. Two figures, detaching themselves from the shadows of the forest. They were dressed in dark clothing, moving with the fluid, silent grace of predators. They did not rush the cabin. This was a reconnaissance. One moved to the left, flanking the clearing, while the other moved to the right, their paths a perfectly executed pincer movement. They used the trees for cover, pausing every few yards to scan the cabin, the truck, the silent watchtower. Ghost remained utterly still at Jacob's side, the growl in his chest a constant, low vibration. He did not bark. It was as if he understood the need for silence, for observation. Jacob raised the rifle, settling the stock against his shoulder. He looked through the scope, the optics gathering the faint starlight, bringing the figures into sharp relief. He could see the glint of a weapon on one man's back. He placed the crosshairs on the center of the man's chest. His finger rested lightly on the trigger. He could end this, right here, right now. But he held his fire. He was not an executioner. He was a soldier. And a soldier gathers intelligence before he engages. The two men completed their sweep of the clearing, their search thorough and professional. They communicated with subtle hand signals. After a final, long look at the dark, silent cabin, they seemed to reach a decision. As silently as they had appeared, they melted back into the blackness of the woods. Jacob stayed motionless for a long time after they were gone, his eyes scanning the tree line, the rifle still pressed to his shoulder. He slowly exhaled, the breath he didn't realize he had been holding. The immediate threat had passed, but he knew, with a chilling certainty, that this was just the beginning. The shadows had come to his door, and they would be back. The minutes after the two figures vanished back into the woods were the most tense of all. Jacob remained at his post by the window, rifle at the ready, his entire being focused on the black wall of the forest. He listened, not just with his ears, but with the instinct honed by years of survival for the slightest sound out of place. But there was nothing. Only the cold, indifferent whisper of the wind. Ghost remained beside him, a statue of tense muscle and coiled energy. The low growl had subsided, but his body was still on high alert, his ears pricked, his nose twitching, sampling the night air for any trace of the intruders. After a long, silent hour, Jacob finally allowed himself to move. He didn't relax, but the immediate threat seemed to have receded. They were not coming back tonight. That had been a test, a probe to gauge his reaction. The real fight was yet to come. He spent the rest of the night securing his position. He slid the heavy steel bar across the inside of the door, the solid thud echoing in the small cabin. He checked the latches on the reinforced windows. He laid out his limited supplies on the table, the rifle, the 2 boxes of ammunition, a first aid kit, the powerful flashlight, and Arthur's journal. He was a lone soldier in a remote outpost, preparing for a siege. As the first hints of dawn painted the eastern sky, a new sound began to mix with the whisper of the wind. It was a low, mournful howl that seemed to come from the mountains themselves. The temperature inside the cabin, which had been cool, began to plummet. A deep, penetrating cold settled into the log walls. Jacob went to the window. The sky was no longer the clear, star-dusted canopy of the night before. A thick, churning blanket of gray clouds was rolling in from the north, moving with an unnatural speed. The world was losing its color, turning into a monochrome landscape of gray and black. The first snowflake fell just after sunrise. It was a large, wet flake that drifted lazily down and melted on the dusty ground. Another followed, and then another. Within minutes, the air was filled with a swirling curtain of white. This was no gentle autumn snowfall. This was a blizzard, a sudden, violent squall roaring down from the mountains with a fury that felt personal. The wind howled, shrieking through the pines, and the snow began to fall in a blinding horizontal sheet. The world outside the small windows dissolved into a maelstrom of white. Jacob watched, a grim understanding dawning on him. This storm changed everything. It was both a cage and a cloak. It trapped him here, cutting him off from any possibility of escape or communication. The town was miles away, through treacherous terrain that was now becoming impassable, but it also trapped them. The convoy he had seen, with its precious, heavily guarded cargo, was now stuck somewhere out there in the raging storm. Their operation was compromised, their timeline was ruined, and they knew there was a witness nearby who had seen them. He now understood the reconnaissance of the night before. They weren't just checking him out, they were planning their assault, and the storm had just given them the perfect cover. No one would hear the gunshots. The snow would cover their tracks, cover any evidence, cover a grave. They could erase him, and the world would never know. "They're coming, boy," he said quietly to Ghost, who had come to stand beside him, his warm body a comforting presence against the bitter cold. The dog looked out at the swirling chaos, then back up at Jacob, a soft whine in his throat. He understood. Jacob's training took over, his mind clear and focused, the fear pushed aside by the cold logic of survival. He moved with purpose. He filled every container he could find with water from the hand pump, not knowing how long he would be trapped. He opened a can of beans and ate it cold, forcing himself to take in the calories. He needed to be strong. His gaze fell upon Arthur's old military radio, which he had found in the shed. It was his only hope of contacting the outside world, but he hadn't had a chance to test it. He brought it inside, the metal cold to the touch. He checked the batteries and hooked up the antenna. He turned the dial, and the speaker crackled to life with a hiss of static, punctuated by the angry roar of the storm's interference. It was useless for now, but maybe, if he survived the assault, and if the storm passed, it would be his salvation. As the afternoon light began to fade, swallowed by the relentless blizzard, Ghost suddenly stood at attention, his body rigid. A deep, rumbling growl started in his chest, more menacing than any Jacob had heard before. It was the sound of an imminent, deadly threat. Jacob grabbed the rifle and moved to his position by the window, his heart a cold, heavy drum in his chest. He peered through the thick, swirling snow. He could barely see the edge of the clearing. They were out there, using the storm as their shield, moving into position. The wait was agonizing. The wind howled, a symphony of rage from the sky. Every gust that shook the cabin, every branch that scraped against the roof, sounded like an approaching footstep. Then, through the roar of the wind, came a new sound, a sharp, cracking report. Splinters of wood exploded inward from the doorframe, just inches from Jacob's head. The first shot had been fired. The siege had begun. The sharp crack of the rifle shot was immediately followed by the sound of splintering wood. Jacob didn't flinch. He dropped to the floor, pulling Ghost down with him with a firm hand on his back. His mind was a sea of calm. The chaotic panic of his civilian life washed away by the cold, clear purpose of combat. He was no longer a man haunted by war. He was a soldier within it. "Stay down, boy," he whispered, his voice steady. Ghost obeyed, his body pressed flat against the floorboards, a low growl still vibrating in his chest. Another shot rang out, this one shattering the reinforced glass of the window to his left. The glass held, spiderwebbing into 1,000 cracks but not breaking through, a testament to Arthur's paranoid foresight. They were testing his defenses, trying to draw him out. Through the blizzard's roar, he could hear them shouting to each other, their voices muffled and distorted by the wind. They were closing in, using the storm's white curtain as cover. He crawled silently across the floor to the opposite window, the one furthest from the initial shots. He peeked cautiously over the sill. Through the swirling snow, he saw a figure break from the tree line, running in a low crouch toward the blind side of the cabin. A second man provided covering fire. It was a classic flanking maneuver. But they didn't know he was watching. Jacob raised his rifle, the stock fitting perfectly against his shoulder. The scope was almost useless in the blinding snow, so he sighted down the barrel, relying on instinct. He didn't aim for the man's chest or head. His mission was not to kill. It was to survive, to neutralize the threat. He exhaled slowly, his finger squeezing the trigger. The rifle bucked against his shoulder with a deafening roar that filled the small cabin. The running man cried out, a sharp yelp of pain, and crumpled to the ground, clutching his leg. He wasn't dead, but he was no longer a threat. "One down!" a voice screamed in anger from the woods. The covering fire intensified, bullets thudding into the thick log walls of the cabin like angry hornets. Jacob scrambled back from the window, pulling Ghost with him into the center of the room, the safest point from the incoming rounds. They were pinned. He needed to change the equation. He needed help. His eyes fell on the military radio. Arthur's last resort. It was a long shot, but it was the only one he had. While the attackers regrouped, he crawled toward it, dragging the rifle with him. He flicked a series of switches, the static hissing loudly. He remembered Arthur's journal mentioning a special antenna on the roof, designed to cut through interference. He grabbed the handset. "This is a civilian distress call. Is anyone on this frequency?" "Over." "Only static," answered. The wind howled, shaking the very foundations of the cabin. He tried again, his voice louder, more urgent. "Mayday, mayday, mayday. I am under armed assault at the old fire watch station in the Northern National Forest. I require immediate assistance. Over." A voice, faint and crackling, cut through the noise. "This is Ranger Station Delta. We read you. Your signal is weak. Repeat your situation. Over." Relief, sharp and potent, flooded through him. "I am pinned down by multiple armed assailants. I have one hostile wounded. I need backup. Now. Over." The voice came back, strained and full of regret. "Son, we copy your situation, but we are completely snowed in. This blizzard is hitting the whole range. There's no way we can get a vehicle or a chopper up there until this storm breaks. Can you hold out until morning?" Over. Morning. It was an eternity away. The hope that had flared within him flickered. He looked at Ghost, then at the sturdy log walls of his fortress. He had no choice. "Roger that, Delta Station," he said, his voice grim. "I will hold my position. We'll await you at first light. Out." He set the handset down. He was on his own, until dawn. The assault resumed with renewed fury. They were no longer trying to be tactical. They were angry and desperate. They charged the cabin from two sides. Jacob moved between the windows, a phantom in the dark room, firing with disciplined precision. A second man went down, a bullet to his shoulder, spinning him around and sending his rifle flying into a snowdrift. A third took a round to his knee as he tried to break down the reinforced door. Their attack faltered. Cries of pain, now mixed with the howl of the wind. They dragged their wounded comrades back into the relative safety of the tree line, leaving streaks of red on the pristine white snow. A tense, unnerving silence fell over the clearing, broken only by the raging storm. The long night began. Jacob and Ghost stayed vigilant, moving from window to window, watching the dark shapes of the woods for any sign of movement. The cold was a physical presence, seeping through the cracks, chilling him to the bone. He shared the last of his food, a piece of beef jerky, with Ghost, who took it gently from his fingers. They were a unit, two soldiers holding the line. Dawn arrived, not with a brilliant sunrise, but with a slow, gray lightening of the sky. The wind began to die down, the snow tapering off into a gentle flurry. The world was transformed, buried under a thick, white blanket. In the clearing, three figures lay motionless, wounded but alive. Just as the first rays of sun broke through the clouds, a new sound reached them, the deep, rhythmic thumping of a helicopter. It appeared over the ridge, a dark shape against the morning sky, and slowly descended toward the clearing. It was over. Jacob unbarred the door and stepped out into the blinding white, the rifle held loosely at his side. He watched as uniformed rangers deployed from the helicopter, their movements swift and efficient, securing the wounded men and the rest of the gang who surrendered without a fight. A senior officer, a man with a weathered face and kind eyes, approached him. "You must be Jacob," he said, his voice full of respect. "You did good work here, son. Real good work." Jacob could only nod, the exhaustion hitting him like a physical blow. He looked at the chaos in the clearing, then back at his small, battered cabin, and then at Ghost, who stood beside him, his silver-gray coat brilliant in the morning sun, his tail giving a slow, steady wag. The rangers cleared out, taking the criminals with them. The helicopter lifted off, its sound fading into the distance, until all that was left was the profound, peaceful silence of the mountains. Jacob sat on his porch steps, the rifle laid carefully beside him. Ghost rested his head on Jacob's knee. They watched the sun climb higher in the sky, its warmth a welcome promise. The war was over. The ghosts of his past were finally quiet. He was no longer a soldier without a post. He was a watchman, and he was home. Jacob and Ghost's story reminds us that true peace is often found not in escaping who we are, but in finding a new purpose for our scars, guided by a loyalty that never wavers. We believe every tale of a veteran and their loyal companion is a beacon of hope in the quiet places of the world. If you feel the same, we invite you to support our channel by subscribing. Your likes and shares help these stories travel farther, and we would be honored to read your thoughts in the comments below. Another journey is waiting for you right now, in the video that has just appeared on your screen.